All right, here we go. Part 2B, I guess. Part 2, second half of your introduction to the Victorian period. We've already talked a fair bit about the novel in these intro videos so far, but there are two defining features of the 19th century novel that I would like to just quickly emphasize to you. One is the way the 19th century novel handles portraits of the domestic. Those become really important in the context of a country negotiating its identity as a global empire. And two is the quality of realism that we see in novels of this time period. So first, the domestic, or at home in the 19th century novel. Visual art during the Victorian period, as we've discussed a little bit, is really carrying the Romantic torch. There was a big Gothic revival movement going on in architecture, and within that movement, a particular artist named William Morris was a highly influential figure. Morris headed up a little sort of sub-niche movement called the Arts and Crafts movement, which was related to the architecture world, but also had a bit more of an interior design focus. The reason that it's significant will become clear. The arts and crafts movement was a reaction against the mechanization and the loss of artisanship that we talked about in the first video, consequent to industrialization. Morris was heavily influenced by Marxist philosophy and that sense of the value of the common worker and of workers' ownership or access to, the means of production. That really influenced Morris's views on the relationship between art and the production of art, the craftsmanship, the making process behind the ultimate result. Morris's work elevated the value of individual homes as architectural projects and artworks in themselves. Normally, homes weren't thought of as architecture, but Morris thought of them as architecture. And this was kind of a reaction against the centrality at this time of workplaces, factories, civic buildings, commercial production. So he was a major proponent of the idea that everything in a person's home, the home itself and the furnishings of it, should be either useful or beautiful. And ideally, they should be both at the same time. Now, William Morris was a known figure, a going concern at this time. He was influential. But this veneration of the home as a major site of personal cultivation, this idea that the domestic economy is the place where a person's aesthetic and social, political, spiritual values are first lived out, where you practice the exercise of your moral character, which then gets carried out into the wider world, that is also a theme that gets explored extensively in Victorian literature. Victorian authors will often illustrate their opinion on a character's moral standing, whether they're a good guy or a bad guy, and how so, by little strategic choices in the way they describe that character's home. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't the first time this has been done. Setting has been used to comment on character and things like that since forever. But the role of the home does seem to take on new importance in the Victorian period. In some cases, a Victorian writer will tell you everything you need to know about a character before you've learned anything else about them, just by showing you their house. These representations of house and home in Victorian literature are almost always highly sophisticated symbolic commentary speaking to a larger point, a commentary on society or the country or humanity writ large. Sometimes it's a symbolic commentary on the owner of the house, the person that the house represents, through a kind of spiritual or psychological system of representation. And these kinds of trends or devices will show up really clearly in both of the novels assigned for this period. Those of you who read Great Expectations by Charles Dickens should pay close attention to Miss Havisham's house and to the various places that Pip makes his home throughout the book. Those of you reading Jane Eyre will have lots of houses to think about as well, but I dare say that Rochester's house will probably be the one that provokes the most engagement. Yes, so that's representations of the home. Point number 2, realism. As the novel form has been developing from about the mid-1700s to now, the strategies and devices that authors use to tell their stories have been evolving, and some of those approaches have gone in and out of fashion over time. As a general thing, realism, a literary mode that seeks to represent the mundane matter of everyday life and experiences as they really are, avoiding exaggeration, embellishment, or the fantastical. Realism has been evolving continuously over time. Jane Austen is one of the pioneers of capital R realism as it comes to be understood, though her work, I think, is generally considered proto-realism. It's like a forerunner. During the period in which Romanticism and the Regency were happening at the same time, there was a kind of chasm that yawned between sense or reason and sensibility or emotion, passion. But the Victorians ultimately found a way to harmonize these two impulses. And that harmonization, that unique first harmonization that the Victorians achieved, came to define the quality of realism that we see in 19th century novels. This is a realism that is bold and kind of worldly and willing to be stark, but it's also dripping with emotional sensitivity and a kind of idealism at times, to the point that today Victorian literature often tastes for some people kind of saccharine, almost hyper-sentimental. But I would agree that if anybody who writes Victorian literature off as sentimental is not, they're not reading everything, they're skipping chunks. The refinement of free and direct discourse as a narrative style also allowed Victorian novels to really skillfully incorporate the subjective with the objective in their attempts to represent the whole, vivid, factual, if often surprising, reality of life. I mean, if you think about it, with everybody crowded into the cities and the riches of a global empire on display in every shop window along your street, suddenly the whole world, with its jostling variety, its highs and lows, tragedies and successes, its glamour and squalor and cruelty, sanctity and heroism, all of it is jammed together in one place, visible in one frame, ready to be captured by the observant artist's pen. Does that mean that everything gets equal representation? Absolutely not. But we begin to see that sense of the totality jammed into one little window. To me, the closest comparison to this stage of realism in literature, this realism that is still so emotionally heightened and sensitive to the subjectivities of perception or emotion, the closest comparison I can give you is the Impressionist movement that was popular in painting right around this same time. And I'll let you look at some of those pictures on your own time. You can Google them. But the two art styles reflected each other, in my opinion. So Impressionism, you're looking at people like the Norwegian painter Peter Krøyer, a lot of French painters like Pierre Renoir, Edgar Degas, Claude Monet. And Claude Monet, actually, we have a really beautiful poem about him that I've included in our supplementals for Poetry Week in this unit, called Monet Refuses the Operation, and you can see the notes in that on your syllabus. But yeah, that's Victorian realism, and that makes actually a really nice transition into poetry. So, while the novel was absolutely the biggest literary form in the Victorian era, it didn't hold nearly the majority share of the market that it does now. Poetry was still big business in the 19th century. It was popular. Like, people bought volumes of poetry to read for pleasure in their spare time, all the time. They bought poetry, they read it, they performed it for each other, they learned it by heart even, regularly. I mean, I would wager that at the time you're watching this video, you know a few popular songs off by heart. Even if you're not a good singer in the shower or whatever, you could sing them all the way through, you know all the words, because you listen to music often for your own pleasure. And music is really popular in our society. It's extremely accessible, more than at any previous time in history. Well, back in the Victorian era, it would have been just as normal for me to assume that most literate people could recite at least one favorite recent poem by heart. So, what's going on in poetry at this time? How does Victorian poetry distinguish itself from other periods in the ways that we've talked about prose doing? The editors at poetryfoundation.org have this fabulous article called Introduction to the Victorian Period in Poetry, or to Victorian Poetry. And they have a lot of really useful commentary there that I'm going to draw on here for the last little bit. Their article says, quote, "Victorian poetry's most distinctive qualities may stem, paradoxically, from its proximity or its nearness to other genres and forms, theater, fiction, music, visual art, like painting. All of these were poetry's competitors at the time," this article writes, "in a fully stocked cultural marketplace. And yet, more than ever, they were also at this time poetry's models and influences, is what they're getting at. In the era's most heralded poetic innovation," this is still them, "Alfred Lord Tennyson and Robert Browning hybridized drama, fiction, and the lyric poem into a new form called dramatic monologue." Now, in dramatic monologue form, a poet, quote, "impersonates a fictional or historical character and addresses a silent audience," or an implied other character, like a second person in the imaginary scene that this character voice is speaking to. Robert Browning's poem My Last Duchess from our readings is the classic example of this form, dramatic monologue. Tennyson's poem Ulysses is another example, not on our course, but classic. And actually, I might argue that Percy Shelley's sonnet Ozymandias, which we studied towards the end of last term, might reasonably be considered a kind of precursor to, or an early example of this form. But My Last Duchess is really kind of the textbook case of it. In a similar vein, some poets looked back through literary history or actual history and found inspiration in, famous dramatic episodes from myth or Arthurian legend or Shakespeare plays, and they took to writing poems that lyrically and imaginatively reenacted or dramatized these scenes and events. Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade is an example from our reading list of what you might describe as reenactment poetry. We're also covering the Irish poet William Butler Yeats this week. He has a beautiful poem, again, not on our course list, called Leda and the Swan, that fits this category. It reimagines and reenacts a popular story from Greek myth, giving you some of these extra supplemental examples for study purposes in case you're reviewing this video down the road. Speaking of Yeats, Ireland was going through a major cultural and literary renaissance during the 19th century, and man, is it about time. Like, Ireland is really kind of having their moment, beginning to come into their own after so many centuries of just being colonially stomped on, as we've learned. And this is important because it tells you a little bit about some of the poetry coming out of Ireland during this time, but it's also just a little flag as we move into the 20th century, because Ireland has officially got on its feet now, and it's going to be a major player on the literary scene through the modernist period. Yeats is one of the foremost figures of poetry in Ireland through both movements. His life encompasses the Victorian period and also part of the modernist period. So he's going to be our window into what's going on over in Ireland at this time, but it's a small window. He's just one guy. Nevertheless, through his work, we'll see how the early Irish Renaissance, now during the Victorian period, dug deep into Ireland's cultural, literary roots of Celtic mythology and folklore, sort of extending some of those trends from the Romantic period, resulting in pieces like The Stolen Child, which is on our reading list for this unit, really leans into the tense, terrifying, entrancing beauty of the changeling myth. Basically, in Irish folklore, there was this idea that sometimes the fairies will steal human babies, spirit them away from their parents in secret, and take them off to join the fairy world, often leaving a sick or troubled fairy child in the human baby's place that might ultimately die. And, I mean, present day, you can kind of see how this is a myth or a legend that makes sense of child mortality rates, terrible childhood or infant illness, things like SIDS. But that was the story, and that's what's being discussed in The Stolen Child by William Butler Yeats. Victorian poetry also took strong influence from the visual art world. Earlier I described a kind of kinship between the novel's approach to realism and the Impressionist movement in painting around this time. But this picturesque approach to realism, in which life is meant to be depicted as it actually is, but not without infusing a sense of the emotions felt by the person observing reality, often a sense of the sublime or how the world is infused with spiritual charge, that quality shows up in our poetry readings for this unit as well, all over the place. William Butler Yeats' poem, The Cloths of Heaven, has a lot of that going on. But it shows up perhaps more than anywhere else, and very uniquely, in the works of Gerard Manley Hopkins. Hopkins was a Catholic priest of the Victorian period, and his poetry celebrates nature, particularly his impressions of divine presence perceptible in nature. Boys, oh boys, if writers can be described as wordsmiths, maybe, making beautiful new things out of language the way that a blacksmith makes things out of metal by melting the medium down and reshaping it into something new, Gerard Manley Hopkins is the consummate wordsmith. His use of language is so innovative. His application of poetic device is so clever and so intricate. I would almost categorize him as a kind of inheritor of the metaphysical poetry tradition that we got our first taste of with John Donne. Yes, hence you will be writing your first close reading assignment on Hopkins, because he's a great example of again, some of the most successful negotiations of the Victorian period between Romantic influences and upcoming modern influences. Last few notes here. This comes again from the poetryfoundation.org editors. On the ways that modes like painting and music were influencing Victorian poetry, they write, "Visually minded poets pushed poetry towards the picturesque, relishing pictorial detail and painterly embellishments." They point to poets influenced by the pre-Raphaelite painters of this time, people like Christina Rossetti on our reading list, whose brother, Dante Rossetti, was a painter in the Pre-Raphaelite club and a friend of William Morris. These figures, your Pre-Raphaelite folks, both the painters and the poets, they were still reveling in a kind of nostalgia for medieval styles and themes, which you'll see in Christina's poem. These were the real nostalgics, the capital R romantic torchbearers, pining for a sort of constructed memory of a healthier, green, forested, more inherently moral, think chivalrous, medieval era, which they viewed as the perfect opposite of their industrialized present day. Poets like Alfred Tennyson, Algernon Charles Swinburne, his name is hard to say, and Hopkins, all of whom are on our course, they wrote what these editors beautifully describe as, quote, lyrically lush poems that aspired towards music, delighting in mesmerizing meters or rhythms and virtuosic braids of alliteration and rhyme. I mean, hot dang. That is just the best description of what these poets do that I can think of, especially Hopkins. That about covers it. You guys have been champs. Send me any questions you might have about this introduction to the Victorian literature we're going to cover over the next few weeks. I will do my best to cover them in class, especially if you can send them in advance. In the meantime, enjoy the weekend, enjoy the sunshine. I will see you Monday.